So my name is Boyd Pratt. I'm the Adult Programs Associate, which means I have the honor to welcome you to the San Juan Island Virtual Library. And for tonight's program, which is called Salmon Bank, and it's actually the third in a series called Nature Matters, which is co-sponsored by the San Juan Island National Historic Park with Ranger Jeff doing the presentation. First of all, I'm going to do some housekeeping, however. I have you all muted, and I ask you to stay that way until the program is over. It's going to take about, Jeff's going to be about an hour or so, and then there'll be another half an hour or so for Q&A. I also suggest you turn off your video, like I said before. We can actually see what you're doing, like eating and things like that, and so, which is fine. But if you don't want it recorded or if you don't want it seen, then I recommend you turn off your video. At the end, like I said, we'll have a Q&A. There are two ways you can do that. One is that at the bottom of your screen, if you hover at the bottom of your screen and go click on participants, you'll actually see your name there, and you can do various functions that way. One of them is to actually raise your hand, raise a virtual hand, and I'll see that and recognize you in terms of a question. The other way to do it is if you hover at the bottom of your screen, you'll see something called chat. You can actually write your question in there, and I'll try to check that to see what your question is. When we actually go into the presentation itself, I recommend that you hover on the upper right part of it, and you'll see an option for the actual doing a speaker view, small active speaker video. So you'll just be seeing Ranger Jeff in your upper right. You'll see most of the screen in terms of his presentation, and that's really kind of the easiest way to view the whole thing. So again, if you kind of hover over the participants and you go to the second knob on the right, it says show small active speaker video, and go ahead and click on that. We've got a couple of upcoming events. On the 15th of the month, we have a Know Your Islanders talk by Victoria Hipkin and John Rummel, and it's called Life on Mars. And they're both space scientists and have worked a lot with NASA and other groups in terms of actual missions to Mars. And so it should be really fascinating. And they are islanders too, which is great. Then on the 22nd, another Wednesday, Erica Bauermeister will be talking about her books. We've tried to get her twice already. The first time she was stalled by a snowstorm, and the second time she had an accident. So we're great to have her by Zoom. She's going to be talking about her most recent memoir, which is called House Lessons, and also her most recent novel too. And then I just want to remind you that you can find, most of these programs are recorded. If you missed one or if you want to review one, just go to our library website, and at the top taskbar or menu bar, go to events, and under that, just click on recordings and look it up. So definitely the geology one from last month is there. We're going to try to get the rabbits and foxes one up soon. And so they're just a great way to do it. Okay, enough chit chat. With that, I'm going to actually go to Ranger Jeff. He's just been a great help in terms of these programs. He's just a wonderful interpreter, and I'm just going to let him introduce himself and go for it. So take it away, Jeff, please.
Thanks, Boyd, and thanks also to Floyd in the background there for doing all the IT stuff. And thanks to the library and to the park for hosting these. It's been, from my perspective, a true pleasure to be able to continue to communicate with those of you who love the park during these difficult times. And I hope they provide at least something of a respite to those who are unable to come and enjoy the park, even given our limited facilities. Much of the material for this presentation I have to credit to a study of the bank by a lady by the name of Lee Ray. She was the Olympic National Park anthropologist, and she completed the study. I think it took her 3 years to do it in 2003, with major contributions to our beloved Mike Vorey, former ranger, always a ranger actually, on the island. And I drew a lot of my material also from work done by Boyd Pratt from numerous sources. For my part, I am not an expert, as Boyd and Mike and Lee are. I am an interpretive ranger. So my job as an interpretive ranger for the Park Service is to take a complex topic and try and break it down and boil it down, make it interesting, informative, and somewhat entertaining. So I hope we accomplish that with this salmon bank, the fascinating story of a place we do love. I will turn off my video when I start, only because it's really distracting to have to watch yourself while you're trying to present, so forgive me that. So, salmon bank. You'll also hear it sometimes referred to as salmon banks. That's not the official name, although that name does show up in a lot of the interviews done by Lee Ray back in the early 2000s. Also, South Beach, interestingly enough, shows up quite frequently with the name Salmon Bank Beach, which I thought was rather interesting. And all that is holdovers from the original pioneers on the island and those folks that actually worked down at Salmon Bank. It's one of those places we all enjoy as a place to recreate, but the bank onshore and off has some interesting stories to tell. Fascinating stories, I think, to those of us that love history, geology, and particularly those who are concerned about the human's impact on the planet. So with that, I'm gonna turn off my video and let's get started. And if you see some weird formatting stuff, Zoom tends to do that, and I have not found a good way to modify that formatting. I hope it's not too awkward. What is it? The bank is a fish attractant, but it's also an attractant for lots of islanders and visitors from around the world to recreate, to study geology in particular, but also the native species that grow there, some of them endangered. The classic Pacific Northwest Rocky Beach is there with sight lines towards Rainier and Whidbey and over into the Olympics and up to Vancouver Island. It was actually created during the last glacial period, which started about 2.5 million years ago and ended about 12,000 years ago. And the advancing and retreat of those glaciers brought glacial till and lots of those erratics that you see down at American Camp and out into the prairies. Much of the geology there, as you'll see in just a second. I promised Boyd that I won't get too deeply into the geology, as he knows I'm wont to do. But we'll take a quick look at that. The shelf's shallow depths attract annual runs of salmon and halibut that over the millennia have drawn fishers and attracted cultures to the regions of all kinds. Here is Salmon Bank, highlighted in yellow. The depth at mean low tide, where you see that red star, is as little as 6 feet deep. So it is very, very shallow. At the appropriate time, one could probably actually stand up just about where that red dot is, or that red star is at, and have the water be right at the top of their head, assuming they were 6 feet tall. And 1.75 miles of the way, where the blue diamond is at, the water is 402 feet deep. It's that shelf, that drastic change in the depth of water, that steep rise that forces salmon to the more shallow water and makes them easier to catch, thus the name, the bank, or an underwater shelf. So it's that movement of fish along that ridge and up onto that shallow water that really makes it one of the most populated or one of the most prosperous salmon fishing areas in the Puget Sound. Here is just a quick snapshot of the geology. I pointed out what we have here is a lot of glacial deposits. All of this in here, all of this down here in light purple, up in here. This is blown sand from the last glacial period where the Puget Sound was 300 feet lower and the wind blew sand back out of the Puget Sound up onto the shore. Those are the dunes that we see at South Beach. And then the only bedrock that you see on the southern tip of the island is right down here. So I think that's pretty fascinating, and it really shows you what material actually makes up the salmon bank. All glacial till. So roughly 12,000 years since the retreat of the glaciers, and a major uplift occurred on the islands. When the glaciers left, all that pressure was relieved off of the top of the islands, and the islands do something similar to if you put your hand on a mattress and then you take that pressure off and you see the mattress rise. The same thing happens to the islands when the glacial pressure was taken off. It's called isostatic rebound. So when they lifted, the salmon bank obviously lifted with them. And over the millennia, it has then eroded. We see here Mount Finlayson, and all of that glacial material, rain, wind, etc., has eroded and pushed that glacial material down into the Puget Sound. What we have acting to keep that sand, that sediment in place is tidal surges on the southwest side, tidal surges up Cattle Pass and out of Cattle Pass, and then we have wind and waves. You'll know that the predominant winds are coming in this direction, and they're forcing that sand and those waves and those tides right back here. And it's all that activity that's keeping that glacial till, that sand in place, that keeps the salmon banks in place. I will say that during the prime fishing season, for anybody that's interested, this area right in here seems to attract a lot of boats, as does this deep area right here. So if you're looking for any fishing tips, there you go. Convergent zones of any type can create a unique ecosystem and habitat that may not otherwise exist there. You'll notice some of these pictures. These are the same kinds of conversion zones that are creating places like Florida, places like this, the sand dunes that at Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, where the wind is actually trapping the sand at the base of the mountains, will not let it get away. Same thing is happening in the convergence zone at Salmon Bank. The winds and the tides simply won't let that glacial till go. So we have an unusual habitat. You also find a similar thing at the Grand Banks off the coast of Greenland and Newfoundland as well. Above water, we're left with an incredibly beautiful stretch of gravel beach, sand dunes, and blue water that we all love. It was pretty busy down there on the 4th of July, I can tell you. Lots of people were enjoying it that particular day. The coastal bluff at Mount Finlayson is eroding at about 1.7 feet per year. So what does that tell us? That tells us that material is continuing to be added to Salmon Bank. It also tells us that it was probably a good decision to move the county road up higher away from that eroding bank at Salmon Bank. Eventually that road would have been pulled into the water as well. It continues to widen the beach, build the banks, and shorten Mount Finlayson. This natural barrier combined with the natural migration of salmon has created this prime fishing ground, thus the name Salmon Bank. And of course, one component of your national park. It's been used and exploited almost since its inception by orcas and other sea animals, Native Americans arriving from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge, the Hudson Bay Company, American fisheries, and today, not so much exploitation, but use by visitors to the park and also by tourists riding the whaling boats just offshore. Long before Europeans arrived at the bank, Native Americans lived and fished here. Fishing here was mainly a seasonal occupation for the tribes of the Salish Sea. The Sungish, the Suk, the Simiomo, the Lumi, Lummi, Samish, and the Klallam. These black dots you see here, the shaded area, represents the known locations of those native fish camps. I think Boyd is actually studying another one up close to Mitchell Bay. He could probably tell you more about that as well. Pile Point, Dead Man Bay, Andrews Bay, Kanaka, and Mitchell Bay. Those are all fishing villages where the Native Americans camped and fished for salmon. Most on the west side of San Juan was where the salmon moved. So that's where the natives tended to want to fish. The Indians who came here were, I'm going to try and stop that. I don't know why it's, I'm going to try and hold that. The Indians who came here were both nomadic and some did have fixed villages. Instead of teepees like was seen in the plains, native here lived in cedar bark houses supported by large cedar posts. Those long houses were partitioned, with each family having a separate room or rooms depending on their tribal hierarchy. Some of these could be disassembled and moved, though most of them stayed where they were built. You can see a lot of these, particularly on the, actually some remains of some of these on the Pacific coast at Olympic National Park, or just off of Olympic National Park. If one looks at the slated roof line, the slanted roof line, and compare it to the design of our new visitor center at American Camp, if you haven't looked, we do have a blog up on the park website, and you can look at the progress of that. You can see some similarities. That traditional Pacific Northwest architecture began with the Native Americans. It was utilitarian, and it served its purpose, and it's held over. And enter the reef net. And natives were inspired by what they saw, and they simulated it. They employed the sophisticated engineering to increase their efficiency of fishing, with the goal to maximize what they caught and minimizing effort, just like orcas have to increase their odds of survival. Reef netters could catch hundreds of fish a day, but natives, unlike others, never caught more than they needed. And this was in order to keep peace with the salmon. They viewed them as spirited animals, as they do most animals in nature, at least until Europeans arrived. From the Native Americans' perspective, trying to be as efficient as possible did lead to the reef net. And from the reef net, others picked up that technology and modified it and increased its utility. And we'll see the results of that in just a moment. Here you see the reef net. What they were doing is creating a floor, a shelf, a simulated shelf of netting. And the fish would move along the shore. They would encounter this sloping, or this upward sloping floor net, and they couldn't get out to the sides because of more netting, and they would swim right up into the fish trap. The two canoes would hold another net, and once that net was full, Native Americans would take it and pull it to the beach, and women and children would gut the fish and hang them for drying. It was pretty efficient. But even with this technology, they were only motivated to catch hundreds of fish per day, not affecting the ecology of the water system. The Hudson Bay Company lived here too. Arriving in about 1853, they set up the Bellevue Sheep Farm in what were then called the Arrow Islands. We now know them as the San Juans, and established primacy for the British government, or at least they thought so. The goal there was to create enough agricultural and economic sustainability on the islands that the negotiations for who would eventually own the islands would motivate those negotiators to decide in Britain's favor, as we know that didn't happen. That was led by the governor of Vancouver's Island and HBC employees, Hawaiians, and Indians, who created that farm. It was a profitable enterprise, but it was only here for a short period of time. Like any good business people, they learned from those that came before them. And once they learned how to fish from the Native Americans and where to fish, they quickly displaced those Native Americans, forcing them to relocate. So HBC took over some of the prime fishing spots close by to American camp, forcing the Native Americans to go find different places to fish. And it had a dramatic impact on those Native Americans as well. Native Americans who were interviewed for Jace Lee's study, in that early part of the study, recalled actually their ancestors being thrown off of their fishing spots that they had inherited from their ancestors over millennia, and that was taken away from them by the Hudson Bay Company in order to create profits and ship fish worldwide. The HBC was successful, but unfortunately they couldn't compete against something else, something called Manifest Destiny, which was bringing American settlers to the West in huge numbers. When the HBC arrived in the early 1850s, they incented natives to catch more fish. Initially, the natives sold fish to HBC for $4 a barrel. A barrel of fish was about 60 fish, for which the natives were paid about $4, usually in the form of a Hudson Bay blanket. HBC then sold that same barrel of salmon for about $8 to $14 in 1860. So a considerable profit. The Native Americans seemed to profit by it. HBC certainly profited by it. In 1854, HBC stopped buying native salmon and began fishing for themselves, and the purpose was no longer sustainability, but profit. Even with HBC trying to get profit out of those same fishing methods, no damage was really done to the salmon population, although those operations did cease in about 1862. American settlers and the U.S. Army made their homes in the prairies and woodlands above Salmon Bank. During that 12-year infamous pig war, soldiers and settlers alike fished at the bank, and presumably they picnicked and swam there just as you and I do. Families like the Bryants, the Jacobs, the Heidenreichs, the Boyces, and entrepreneurs like Israel Katz, who at one time owned large portions of San Juan Island, were making their homes and making their living around the bank. None of them, I don't think, could have foreseen what was about to happen at the close of the 1860s and the beginning of the 1870s. The Industrial Revolution came west with those settlers who brought, of course, an enterprising mindset, as Americans take everywhere, but they also brought with them new technologies. These new technologies really enabled the entrepreneurial Americans who were then on the island in that second wave to begin taking advantage of Manifest Destiny. They were creating, of course, the American dream, and at that time there were few, if any, regulations or laws restricting an individual's enterprise, at least in 1874 and those early periods. Opportunity met those limited restrictions and the American spirit, and the result was going to be predictable. What really drove that, those pieces of the Industrial Revolution, that technology, the tin can was invented in Europe in 1810 and came to the US in 19. By 1840, the world had gained an appetite for that salmon, originally from the Atlantic salmon that were fished off of the coast of Maine and Newfoundland and the Grand Banks. And the appetite for salmon had grown once the Americans arrived on the Pacific Northwest and found the Pacific salmon. And although the Army left in 1874, commerce was just about to begin in fury. The first Puget cannery, of course, in Mukilteo in 1877. The railroads arrived, allowing the transport of those canned fish, not only across the United States, giving Americans that source of protein that they loved, but they could now get it cheaply, and they could get it relatively fresh in a can, where it might have had to have been salted. They didn't really have the ability to freeze it in those early days, but in a can, it could go almost anywhere and have a long, long shelf life. But the thing that really had the greatest impact on the explosion in commercial fishing in the Puget Sound was the introduction of the gasoline engine into to the process in 1896. It allowed for huge automation of almost every component of the commercial fishing process, not only from the powering of the boats, but also the winches that would winch larger numbers of fish in bigger nets out of the sound, enabling them to catch more fish more quickly and move them more quickly as well. By 1874, commercial fishing at the bank was in full swing. Investment flowed to the region where pioneers were flowing in huge numbers, and all of them needed work. The costs were low and the profits were big in those days. And the results, again, were going to be predictable. As one observer noted, it was a frenzied operation once the sockeye salmon season started. Dormitories were built, shops and dining halls. So we see those flat areas at Salmon Bank running from the beach back into the sides of the prairie. A lot of that was dug out, and there were buildings there, dormitories, there were tents up in the prairies. It was a full-fledged commercial operation. As a matter of fact, one of the early pioneers was actually selling water and supplies from her home up on top of Mount Finlayson. Long into the 1900s, her family was actually supporting some of those commercial fishing operations. Over an 8-year period, sockeye salmon traps caught 300 to 800 fish per day, peaking at about 2,000 fish in July or August. And by 1875, the salmon industry was second only to timber in the Puget Sound. By 1874, commercial fishing at the bank was in full swing. Investment had flowed to the region. The Native Americans were participating in the trade, no longer selling fish back to the Americans, but actually employed by those American fisheries and canneries. They also brought with them Hawaiians, the Kanaka Indians, and the Chinese who were employed at low wages, helping support this huge commercial operation. It's really almost impossible to understate the size of the industry in the Puget Sound and the effect that it had on local economies, as it did when that fishing economy eventually collapsed. When I say exploitation on a massive scale, I want you to look down at the chart on the bottom. From 1913 to 1919, the maximum catch size in the Puget Sound for salmon was 39 million fish. By 1969, that had dropped to about 7 million fish per year. That is exploitation and deterioration of a resource on a massive scale. What was creating that demand? Not only the tin can and safe canning techniques, the wars in Europe and Asia were creating demand. The soldiers needed food. Canned fish could be shipped and was a good source of protein. It was still relatively cheap. Prices did increase as demand increased, fueling even more fishing. So as demand increased, it made things even worse and worse. The entry of the railroads enabled the fisheries to further exploit the demand. They were no longer selling to the United States. They were now selling these canned salmon coming from the Puget Sound all over the world. And those gas and steam engines really enabled the fisheries to exploit that resource in an incredible scale. And as we all know, for every action, as Newton said, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Nature was providing the supply. Geology had focused the supply at the bank. Demand was fueled by an appetite created by the New England salmon industry and boom in the 1700s all the way up into the 1900s. And again, the result was predictable. And I think we all know what happened with that. Roughly 50 years, American ingenuity met an abundant supply and virtually no restrictions. Estimates of salmon harvest in the region during those peak fishing years of 1880 to 1930 show as many as 39 million fish taken annually from the Sound. Fish were being taken, canned, shipped across the U.S. internationally. Demand drove harvest, and the world benefited from that new, tasty, healthy, affordable protein, salmon in a can. On July 12, 1917, at a single trap at Salmon Bank, and keep in mind that there were usually about 12 of these traps run along Salmon Bank. They would actually run about half to 3/4 of a mile out into the Puget Sound, and they were huge nets staked on telephone poles that were taken down at the end of each season. By law, they had to take these traps down and pull them back up on the bank. But at one time, there were 12 of these. Imagine these 12 operating on July 12, 1917. One of those traps caught 28,000 sockeye salmon in a single day. Now multiply that by as many as those 12 fisheries, 100 days in a season, times 50 years of overfishing. We have the result today in front of us. Today, the annual harvest numbers are closer to 200,000 or fewer fish per year. That doesn't leave a whole lot for our orca neighbors. In 1934, because even then, in 1870, as early as 1877, the state temporarily closed that fishing, but didn't enforce it. So commercial fisheries continued to go about their business without much interaction with the authorities. At the same time, fish are being affected by pollution, loss of habitat. The first dam in the region was built in 1911, which restricted spawning. So in 1934, all these forces that had been building over roughly 50 years came to a head, and Washington State said, we can no longer tolerate this. It's having a dramatic impact up and down the food chain in the ecosystem. So they outlawed fish traps and fish wheels in response to that collapse. There are some traps and wheels that are still operated by Native Americans under treaty. Other than that, it's almost all hook, sinker, and line. Unfortunately, even in 1934, that action of restricting or outlawing wheels and traps was too late. And unfortunately, those fish have never recovered. The salmon bank today. Chinook catches in the Puget Sound are down from 1 million Chinook in 1973 to about half of that in 2017. It remains an important fishery for the resident orcas, although we see fewer resident orcas and fewer groups of individuals. The future for the fish that lend the banks their name is questionable, I think. And though major initiatives are active and underway to increase salmon numbers in the Sound, their future, I think we have to all agree, remains in question. Salmon Bank represents both an enduring hope for an invigorated salmon and orca population, and an enduring reminder of the devastating power humans do or can do to harm our environment. But it's also good to remember that it's now a protected place, a place of peace and tranquility, and an example of the power of humans to learn from their mistakes and to change. Such is the legacy of the Salmon Bank. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Boyd, and we can take some questions. And Boyd, I hope you'll jump in and help me answer some of the questions that might come up.
Sure, happy to do so. So I'm going to check the chat here and see if I don't have anything in the chat. So if anybody wants to raise their hand virtually, I'd be happy to recognize them. And I'm not seeing anybody. Am I doing this incorrectly? Okay, I have a question from Amanda Thiel to everyone. How long was reef netting the common way to fish?
Well, the salmon arrived after the last glacial period about 5,000 years, ago. Native Americans probably began arriving in the area about 9,000 years ago. So we have to assume that reef netting was popular among the Native American population at least 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, I would think. So it was perfected, I imagine, pretty quickly. If you'll look in the artifact collection for the park, you'll see some of that technology on display, some of the anchors that held the nets down, some of the fishing hooks that they used apart from reef netting, etc. So I think we have to assume that it's at least 5,000 years old.
Okay. Another question is from Diane Stepida. What can be done to help the salmon recover?
Well, I think if you're really interested in that topic in depth, the governor's resident orca task force is a good place to look. If you'll just do a search on that, you can find it. So there are lots of things affecting the population. Pollution is a big one. Another one is loss of habitat, and there are ongoing efforts to, of course, decrease pollution going into the sound, both from agriculture, but also dumping, illegal and legal dumping. There's also efforts underway to restrict the amount of new habitat that can be consumed by development. So in order to get a permit to build in lots of places in the state of Washington now, especially in the Puget Sound watershed, it's very difficult to get a permit, number one. And number two, they are really scrutinized very closely. You have heard efforts that to try and pull down some of the dams. I think that that's probably a very difficult row to hoe, so to speak, trying to pull a dam down that provides electricity to large segments of people. You see some of the things that actually were recommendations out of the governor's task force to increase the distance between whale watching boats and orcas, and to slow down the speeds as well. I know that a lot of the whale boats have gone to a higher frequency. I think I've got that right, not higher and lower, to change the frequency on their depth finders and their fish finders, that so it won't interfere with the echolocation of the orcas. The orcas and the mammals take a pretty small percentage of the salmon in the Puget Sound. We, as human beings, take the vast preponderance of them. Someone asked me a couple of days ago, as a matter of fact, should I stop eating salmon? I do that. That's probably more of a moral stand that I've taken than probably having a huge impact on the salmon, but I've chosen to do that. You might consider that for yourselves. Can you think of others, Boyd?
No, I think that I think efforts to kind of reduce the noise. Well, it's kind of a trifecta in terms of chemical pollutions like PCBs, and then in terms of actual noise, and that gets into the whole whale watch thing and how close can you get, and then the actual supply, as you said, the supply of salmon. So it's important to address all three of those areas, although I don't specifically have recommendations right now. So
I think one thing to keep in mind, and this is just a cautionary note, this is by no means a warning, or by no means thumbing our nose at any industry on the islands or in the islands. But when the fishing industry collapsed in the Puget Sound, it had a huge economic impact across the entire region. In 1934, when those fish traps went out of business, essentially everyone employed in those businesses was immediately out of work. So think about the 50% of the population in and around the islands suddenly being thrown out of work. The cautionary note here is, what happens if we were to lose the whale watching industry, or if it was to be dramatically affected, if the orcas were no longer coming to the region because there's no more salmon to eat. So there is a real economic impact to losing the salmon in the Sound, and it directly correlates to losing the orcas in the Sound.
I'm going to bring up another question. Is there a buoy over the very shallow area? Can't remember.
Yeah, it's actually at the tip. If you will, if you're down at the overlook, I think it's called Jackson's Overlook, and you'll look straight out into the Sound. In the distance, you'll see a green buoy. That is the tip of the bank. And what that does is it directs boats around that bank. Small boats can certainly get over it, even at low tide. But at low tide, anything with a draft deeper than 6 feet is probably going to have trouble. And that's what that buoy is there for, to direct people around the tip of that bank.
Thank you. So April has a question. Can you describe what the current state of fishing is? Who fishes there? Companies? What limits are in place? And are all types of salmon regulated?
I'm not the guy to ask on that. I can tell you that the website for Department of Natural Resources for the state of Washington has a lot of that information. That's where most of that information resides. The Fish and Wildlife Service also has some information on that, although not as detailed. The real control of that fishery is with the Department of Natural Resources for the state of Washington. And just go to their website and there's lots of really good information there. I do not know those laws, those restrictions, or who's fishing there.
So I think this probably is best answered that way. This next one is best answered that way. What is an estimate of the daily recreational fish catch now?
Well, when I'm down there, I wish it was higher. Apart from that, I do not know. But again, if you're a fisherman in the state of Washington, particularly fishing for salmon, you'll know that you have reporting requirements. So the state of Washington has a lot of really good detailed data about who's catching fish, what kind of fish, when they're catching them, size, etc. A lot of really good information. And all this has been, all this information is being drawn historically. Number one, the fisheries in the Puget Sound are so incredibly important to the Washington state economy that this data has been collected since the 1850s, actually. There was a report in the 1820s about the numbers of fish in the region. When the Spanish first came here, they were commenting on the number of fish in the region. So this has been closely watched and observed for a very long time. And there's a lot of really good data out there, very detailed data. And it is to preserve that natural resource that's so incredibly important to the economy and to, it's how we live as Washingtonians.
So the next one, which Jeff, if you don't mind, I might tackle is, do you know what salmon trap nets were made of? And did reef netting stop when fish traps started? Well, I'm going to take the second one first, and then I'll go into the first. So yes, the reef netting did stop when the fish traps started. The fish traps really kind of came into the area in the late 1880s and 1890s. They were first over near Boundary Point, Boundary Bay, and that area, which was heavily reef netted by the Lummi and others. And the fish trap people basically forced the Lummi out of there. They just simply put in their traps and blocked the locations. And so reef netting continued on a very, very small scale, although most of the good reef net spots were taken by traps. And so it wasn't really instituted again until the 1930s after the ban on fish traps. And they actually got the right to do reef netting again. And there was a revival from that point, and it continues to this day. In fact, it's written into the state law and the regulations that very specific spots you can only get licenses for very specific spots, including quite a few in the San Juan Islands. So that's why you see reef nets there. As you probably know, the reef nets back then were actually nettle fiber and willow bark. Or today, of course, they're usually synthetic materials. The salmon trap nets were actually two parts. So the lead, which was the long thing on piles that led to the heart of the trap, were actually metal. It was like a chicken wire mesh that was kind of put in an accordion file, and that was attached to the top of the piles and then actually let down to the bottom of the ocean so that no salmon could get through there. So they encounter that lead, they start heading towards what's called the heart of the trap. There's a big heart, which is kind of a diamond-shaped area that they go into, and they kind of mill around, and then they go into the little heart or the inner heart. And again, these areas are enclosed by this wire mesh that goes all the way down to the bottom. After that, they go into an area that's called the pot, and in a side area called the spiller. And this was actually a full bottom net that was cotton fiber that had been dipped in tar. So it was tarred, and they would then braille the fish out. So they would actually take this like a big dip net, basically, and they would pull it up on one side and dump the salmon into a scow and then take it to the canneries. So it was a very efficient operation. And anyway, so that's kind of what they were made of.
I think there's an interesting, so I give the salmon bank talks during the summer usually, of course not this year, but there's an interesting irony to this entire cycle that we talk about. You know, the orcas were the first to fish here. The Native Americans presumably watched the orcas and how a couple of orcas would get just offshore of the salmon banks and force the fish back towards shore and towards that shallower water where the other orcas could feed. So the Native Americans learned from the orcas. HBC watched and learned from the Native Americans. And then Americans came along and learned that reef netting technique and put it on steroids. So what you have here, the irony is that the orcas taught the Native Americans, who taught HBC, who taught the Americans, and now the Americans have almost starved the ones that taught us all how to fish, starved them to death. I think that's a strange irony.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question from Sue. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of fish farming?
I'm not a fish farm guy. I wish we had invited somebody from Fish and Wildlife. Do you know much about that, Boyd? I can not say that I do.
Just a little bit, and this is a very biased perspective, Sue, so I apologize. You know, you probably read in recent notes about the breaking down of the barriers in regard to the fish net, finfish production near us, actually not in our islands, but near us, by Cook Aquaculture. And one of the concerns was that fish stock was, well, there are two main concerns. One is that fish stock was not native salmon. And so there was concern that there would be possible transmission between the two species, but also in terms of actual parasites and diseases. So there's actually studies done where wild salmon swimming near finfish pens actually contracted diseases of the fish that were in the pens. And of course, the fish in the pens are given antibiotics and all sorts of stuff. So that's a major issue. I think the other issue is that they're fed food and they're actually given a dye in order to turn their flesh to look as if it's red salmon. And that in turn is a source of both the leftover food and also the waste from the fish being in a concentrated area. It's basically like a feedlot, a cattle feedlot. And so it's a major cause of pollution. And I think those are the two main concerns that I've heard about that.
Of course,
Again,
the upside of that is we have cheap salmon in market, or relatively cheap salmon in market that's competing with the wild salmon, and that affects the market for the wild salmon, pulls the price of that wild salmon down.
Yeah. And I have another one from Diana. How can we protect forage fish breeding areas?
Not sure I'm not sure I understand that question. How we protect the habitat?
Yeah, for the forage fish, which are the feed for the salmon, if I understand it correctly, Diana.
Yeah, well, the main concern there is the loss of eelgrass. So eelgrass protects not only the hatchlings, the salmonids, the baby salmon, once they're hatched, keeps them protected. It's also a prime feeding spot for adult and even immature salmon, where the smaller fish lay their eggs and where the smaller fish reside as well. So protecting that eelgrass is of preeminent importance. As a matter of fact, there's if I'm not mistaken, they may be in the park now, a fish biologist that is looking at salmon grass or eelgrass around the islands and trying to understand the increase or loss of that eelgrass, and trying to understand across the Puget Sound what's the effect of increase or decrease of certain amounts of eelgrass in the ecosystem. So people are looking at that, and that is one of the prime factors around not only the hatchlings for the salmonids, but also the feeding fish as well.
Yeah, I will throw out that I hope one of our attendees is Drew Harville, who's written quite a bit about the loss of eelgrass in our islands. So I'm sure she would be happy to answer questions to anybody who has that. So another one from Beth. Well, it's a statement, actually. We need to protect forage fish spawning beds from shoreline hardening, from runoff, from foot traffic over fish eggs on the gravel shores, etc., which I think is absolutely true.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Of course, we do that at the park, and Land Bank does that. Folks that buy property around the shoreline are restricted from certain things that they can do. But I think probably the bigger impact is runoff, what's coming off of agricultural land, what's being dumped legally and illegally, and what impact does that have on the eelgrass and the rest of the water ecosystem.
Well, I think I've come to the end of questions in chat, unless anybody has another question that they'd like to type out. Again, I'm not seeing hands. I don't know if that function didn't occur, but in any case, I really appreciate both Jeff, your wonderful presentation, and everybody's great questions. And as I said, we are recording this. We hope to get it up within the week on the library website. And if anybody has follow-up questions for Jeff, I'd be happy to connect you guys and follow up on that. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.